session being put on by Mexit, Maximize the Value of Your Exit, and Katie Professional Services Corporation. So I'll be your moderator / presenter for the first few moments. Let me turn my timer on so that I make sure that I stay on time, and we will start. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about maximizing your business value planning, creating maximum value in a business. And that's my session. I'm Robert Welke, and I'll be presenting this. We're going to talk about a couple things. One of the things we're going to talk about this morning is best in class, and what is best in class and why does it matter? Best in class is a product that is considered superior to other competitors with the same category or segment, and the product offers the highest quality and or utility in comparison to its peers. So what do best in class business owners focus on? Well, they focus on, oh, hang on, what happened here? Okay. I'm sorry, we have a challenge here this morning. Okay. Let's go to the next one. Okay, what do the best in class focus on? There we go. They focus on these key areas to deliver success, and they are operational excellence, good business systems, building a great culture, building sustainability into the business, innovation, and quality, not cost, and all of those lead to higher profit. So when we talk about a business, every business has a value, and that range of value for each business falls within what we call a range of value, or a multiple range within the industry or subsector that they trade on. Businesses do not have control over what range of value that they fall in. Each industry sector and each subsector is defined by the private equity markets, because we don't have public capital markets determining value. It's the private equity markets that do that. But what they do have control over, and it's absolute control, is where they fall within that range of value. And what we find that best in class values focus on finding out where they fall within that range of value, and then working towards working to the highest end of that range of value. So if we take a look at a basic graph of what a range of value and a multiple might look like within an industry sector, the average EBITDA in this case is 3.75, and for some companies, if they fall below that 2, they're unsellable, and they're over 5.5 in terms of the multiple. That means they actually could be, quite frankly, going into a strategic range and falling outside and are more valuable than the industries typically in that range of value. So if you take a look at a company, and what does this mean? So let's talk about a company here that same company, 3 different scores, 3 different areas. They're successful in 3 different leveling ways. So a current value might, the current company at the higher level might have a multiple of 3.1, and that's because they're not quite ready for sale. They're not very attractive yet. They've got to work on a few things. Their EBITDA is lower than the industry average, so they're not going to be as expensive. They're not going to be as valuable. If you can work towards the higher class or the best in class for performance and get a better readiness score and a better attractiveness score, it's also going to drive up the multiple. But while you're doing that, if you're working towards becoming best in class, typically you're also going to see that you're getting better financial performance. So same company, same sales. Why is the value higher? Because they're operating more effectively and they're actually operating in a best in class scenario. So how do you work towards best in class? Well, there are 3 key functions that we talk about when we in our process. We talk about getting business, supporting business, and delivering business. And in general terms, what that means is getting business is focusing on the key things that create business: increasing market share, recurring revenue, new tech, new products, new markets, new IP. That's how you get business, right? That increases the future potential value. Then there's delivering business. How are you actually delivering the things that you're actually you're making or selling? And operational excellence, increase quality, speed, and efficiency, reducing costs, increasing customer loyalty, brand loyalty helps on the delivery piece. And the next step is support. How do you manage the business and support the business in growing? And that's organizational structure, your team building, best practices, all improving your management information systems, HR, all those kinds of things are the things that are in the support business. So today we're going to talk about one of the pieces of delivering business, and that is operational excellence. So we talked about what operational excellence is. So really, it's a mindset that embraces certain principles and tools to create a culture of excellence within an organization. Now, that operational excellence means that every employee can see, deliver, and improve in the flow of value to a customer. So it's not limited to management. In operational excellence employs continuous improvement throughout the process. So here's 10 tips for you to think about. And I should let you know that this presentation will be available. We're recording it and it'll be available to all participants and anybody who registered afterwards. But 10 tips to keep in mind when you're talking about operational excellence. It includes both people and process. It's not just relegated to one or the other. It involves everybody, right? Things to remember, salaries and wages typically are the largest expense within any company, so you've got to optimize how you're using those. People always want to do good work, and if you provide them with the opportunity to do that, they will. There are very, very few quick fixes when it comes to operations and established businesses. So if you've been around for a while, you have some entrenched practices and some entrenched systems that need to be potentially evolved or worked on. You will need to systemize processes that exist in your head as a business owner. A lot of business owners, particularly small business owners, run their business from their head and they don't have documented systems and processes. Small wins build in motivation, but large wins improve ROI. So we'll focus on the small wins first to get the big wins later. Don't be afraid to ask for help. There are a lot of resources out in the industry, out in the marketplace that can help you, from paid people to free resources. Take advantage and take a look. It's worth your time. Management, and here's an important thing that people need to realize, is in most companies, management only sees about 4% of a company's real problems. It's the iceberg effect. They only see the symptoms. They don't see the underlying sources of problems. And operational systems, which is what we're going to talk about here, de-risk businesses. What does de-risking mean? Well, de-risking a business means de-risking the reliance on one person, one activity, one client, one supplier, etc. De-risking means you're making the business more valuable. Most times you don't need, from that last slide, it did not come up. My apologies. Most of the time, you don't need to fix things, you just need to use them correctly. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about 10 steps to work on your business. So first few steps involve step one, designing your offering. Having a clear picture of what it is you're actually selling to your clients or delivering to your clients is critically important, because having a clear picture of what that is defines how you're going to actually build it, deliver it, and service it. Step two is your order taking. What is your order taking process? Right. And when I'm talking about operational excellence, you're thinking about these are the things you need to build in your business. So an order taking process is what happens when a client actually phones you and says, okay, I want to buy something. What is the process? What are the steps that you follow from the minute that order is taken until the minute that service or product is delivered? And what are the outcomes that you're looking for in each step? And it's critically important that you understand that as a business owner, because that will affect quality and efficiency in terms of how you deliver that. A third step is the project management step, which is who's actually doing what and when in the company. It's critically important that everybody understands what their role is and where they fit within the company, so that they can actually deliver accordingly and effectively within the organization. And then, of course, there's the procurement phase. You need to formalize all the different relationships you have with customers, with suppliers, and anybody else you deal with. Do you have agreements in place? Do you have MSAs? Do you need POs? Do you understand how your suppliers and your customers work with respect to the management of procurement within their company? And then build a system around delivering within their framework. So the next step along the way is the resource management. Once you've identified what you're going to do, you better figure out how you're going to do it and what you need to do it, right? So what do you need in terms of people? What are the equipment, what material, and what is your timeline? Because that is a resource that many people don't consider. What is the timeline and what are the critical timelines for delivering that product or service? Another area you need to focus on is your facilities management. How will that service or product be delivered, and how will it be fulfilled? What are the physical requirements you need to build it, deliver it, and or service it? So if you're a service company, do you need vehicles? Do you need equipment? Do you need tools? How do you build the process around those things? Step 7 is technology management. How are you going to harness the technology that's available to you right now to enhance the delivery speed and quality of that service or product as you build it and as you evolve? Critically important that you think about how you can integrate your systems, because having 2 or 3 different systems where people are inputting information, discreetly into each system, it creates an opportunity for various points of failure within a business. Ideally, you should only have to put information into a system once, and it should be able to carry through the process continually. Team management is going to be an important part of building a really good system and process, right? And operational efficiency. How are you going to staff it? How are you going to manage those people? How are you going to hire them? How are you going to optimize what you're doing with your people, and how are you going to schedule them effectively? Step 9 is the quality control process. How are you going to implement that quality control process? Who's going to be responsible for it? How are you going to measure it? And how are you going to improve on it? Those are key parts of any business, whether it's a service or a product manufacturing. You need to understand how you're going to actually do that. And you should have a dashboard around figuring out how you're going to manage it. It's got to be visible to everybody, and they need to be able to act on it. Step 10 is sales management. Who's actually doing the sales? Well, you're building the piece of equipment. Who's taking care of going out and getting the next order, the next sale? And sales is different than marketing, and sales is different than business development. So understand that going in. We won't talk about that today, but it is an actual topic unto itself. Step 11 is distribution. How are you going to deliver your product or service, and what are your constraints? Are there specific things that you need to address when you're delivering your product? Is it time-based? Is it geographic-based? Is it people-based? What are the issues you're going to have to deal with in delivering that service and distributing that service? And lastly, packaging. What does your deliverable look like? How are you going to have it? How are you going to have it packaged? And that's more than just talking about putting in a box. If you're delivering a report or you're delivering a service, what does that look like, and what does it include? And most importantly, is it consistent between customers? Is it consistent between jobs? And the branding of that is pretty critically important, because how you do your work and how you deliver that work is going to become part of your brand. I want people to think about this from the perspective of systems deliver results and people deliver systems. So I'm going to talk about some sobering perspectives here as we get forward. In Canada, only 1 in 10 businesses actually sell successfully. 3 out of 4 business owners regret the way they exit their business 1 year later. Many business owners do not complete the necessary planning to tax optimize their sale proceeds when they do sell. And it can take anywhere between 2 and 5 years to prepare a business for a maximum value exit if there was no preparation along the way. So what does that have to do with operational excellence? Well, if you want to sell your business and get the most money for it, you have to have a level of operational excellence within your company that drives you towards best-in-class value. And remember that it's preparation and not timing that's going to determine whether the sale will be successful in the future. The good news is companies that focus on creating value in their business are more profitable and more highly sellable at the end of the day. What makes a company sellable? Well, let's talk about that. Great people, having a fabulous team and a good culture. As a friend of mine likes to say, culture are the behaviors that you tolerate within your company. So if you're tolerating behaviors that you wouldn't accept at home or anywhere else, then you need to think about how you're going to manage that. Great brands. What makes a great brand? Consistency, good packaging, delivery, how your people actually do the work, and how your equipment or your product actually performs is going to create your brand. Customer loyalty is going to be critically important as well. How loyal are your customers? How do you know how loyal your customers are? Has anybody done a survey to find out whether their customers really like what they do and what you could improve? One of the ways to determine whether or not you've got a good product is to get references from your customers. And one of the ways to do that is through the NPS, Net Promoter Score survey, which gives you a pretty good indication as to what the future value of your company is going to be. Efficient systems and business processes are going to be critically important to the effective sale of your company, right? If you can have a company where the owner does not have to be there all the time, the business is not owner dependent, as we like to say, then you actually have a better chance of selling your business. Buyers are not looking to buy work in progresses. They're looking to buy something they can actually invest in and immediately turn into a profit-making machine. Solid financial performance is going to be a critical factor in whether or not a business is sellable. And that's going to be based on, financial performance is really going to be based a lot on how well your company runs. So I like to tell people the best insurance a company can actually have is having a sellable business. Because if you're an owner and you need to get the money out of your business to retire or to fund your retirement, you better have something that you can sell. And knowing what to do and doing it will pay off in spades. So a little bit about me. I'm an exit planner, certified exit planner. I have a little bit of experience in strategic planning, leadership, and change management. Started and grew a number of businesses over the last 30 years and created the Mexit proprietary framework for creating maximum value exit using a disciplined process with my associate, Brad Golan. Now we're going to move on to our next presenter, Mike, and he'll tell you a little bit about him. And I'm going to stop screen and let him start sharing. There you go, Mike. Mike, you're on mute, it sounds like.
I'm talking away. So I was just saying that, your presentation was fantastic. The amount of nuggets that you shared with us was unbelievable right from the very beginning. And my suggestion to people that are on this presentation is that you would take the recorded version of this after and go back through it again, because some of those topics, Rob, you could teach on some of those topics alone, and they were jammed into one presentation. So there was so many nuggets in one presentation. I loved it, because these are things that over 20 years in business for myself, that I've had to learn a lot of these things the hard way along the way. So the more you could learn these things and start digging them and start implementing them, the further ahead you're going to be. So fantastic presentation, Rob. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that.
Now, can you everybody see my screen? We're okay there?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's jump in. So we talked about maximizing the business value planning, and I think that was, again, a fantastic presentation. And I'm going to talk about structuring your business for future exit at some point. And, a lot of people say, well, I'm not thinking about exit. Well, it doesn't matter if you're thinking, like Rob said, it's a process along the way that you do to prepare your business for inevitably you're going to exit one day. Whether you sell it, whether you close it, whatever you may do, there's going to be something that happens that you're going to exit your business. And that's exactly where I'd like to start. You will always exit your business, even if it's just partially. There will be times where you need to step away from your business. There will be a time where you need to just step away from your business, probably permanently, whether that's retirement or family emergencies or change in life. So the more prepared you are, the better. And that's why I really like Rob's material and everything we've been doing together on that area. And one of the things you need to know, if you ever take your finger off the pulse of your business, then you need to prepare for exit. And what I mean by that, if you don't know where the financial situation and where the culture is, and those are the two biggest things that I find in business, if you as a business owner don't know where your finances are at or where the culture is at in your business, you have a potential big issue, and your finger is not on the pulse. And when your finger is not on the pulse, I've seen it again and again. I've helped thousands of businesses, both start and succeed, and I've seen some fail. And a lot of them, it's exactly that. They took their finger off the pulse. If you take it off the pulse, the culture or the finance, it's time to bring. So we're going to talk about better structuring. Better structuring brings more value to your business. Better structuring brings more options in exiting your business because we want multiple options. We don't want just one option. We want many options. We also want to minimize tax. The less tax that we can pay, the better, obviously. And we can also look at separating assets because let's be honest, sometimes you want to sell your business, but your business acquired a bunch of assets and you're like, I don't want to let those specific assets go. We need to look at our structuring to separate our assets as we grow. So let's now talk about the next topic, which is business shares. Okay, very important to understand business shares and the sale of business shares and the difference between selling the shares of a business versus selling the assets of a business. Okay, so when you sell shares, it's actually the shareholder that is selling the shares, right? It's not the corporation selling its own shares. That's not typically how it works. It's the shareholder or the owner of the corporation selling its shares, just like as if you own stocks in a main company like Microsoft or Apple or something, and you're selling your stocks. It's the shareholder or the stockholder that sells the shares or the stocks, okay? And those are both very similar. We call stocks when it's a public company, normally we call it shares in a small business. Assets are, on the other hand, are the opposite. They're sold by the corporation. The corporation sells the assets, right? The shareholder sells his shares, but the corporation can sell its assets. And some of those assets, of course, are things like goodwill, things that are intangible, your customer base, your good name, and your reputation. Those have intrinsic value to them. Tax consequences are different for selling shares versus selling assets. There's a big difference when it comes to tax in selling those two shares versus assets. So let's talk about the lifetime capital gains exemption, because I think when you talk about selling shares, you always need to understand the lifetime capital gains exemption. So the lifetime capital gains exemption itself is for qualified shares of a small business corporation that you sell. And when those shares are qualified and you sell them, which we're going to get into that, then you will potentially have a tax-free sale up to a specific amount, which we'll talk about here. The exemption is also available on farming and fishing property. Okay, so this lifetime capital gains exemption is for small business shares, for farming property, and for fishing property. They're combined. Most people, though, are using one or the other. They're not using one. They're either a fisherman, they're a farmer, or they have a small business. The exemption currently for 2022 is $913,630. That's a lot of money. So do you know what that means? That means that you can make up to $913,630 on the sale of your business if you sell the shares and they're qualified before you pay any tax. That's extremely important. That means you're making almost $1 million and paying zero tax. Do you realize that if you made $1 million when you were in business yourself and your net was $1 million in your pocket, just like selling your business, you could pay $300,000 to $400,000 in tax? Now we're going to minimize that, of course, and lower it. But if you made $1 million in your business, you could pay 30% plus 40%, depending what province you're in. So we're talking about $1 million, close to $1 million tax-free on the sale of your business. So let's now get into what those qualified small business shares, because we want to make sure that our shares stay qualified throughout the whole period as much as possible. So if we're ready to sell, ready to make that transition, ready to exit, we're going to maximize that tax savings. So to be qualified, you must own those shares, first of all, for 24 months before you dispose of them. They had to be in your name unless they were for consideration for other shares you own. So if you were doing a share swap and a restructure with the tax lawyer, well, potentially then they might still qualify. But if you just purchased the shares, you just acquired them, they don't qualify for 24 months, okay? So you need to have your shares for 24 months before they can qualify for the deduction, the exemption. For prior to 24 months, okay, this is prior, more than 50% of the fair market value of the assets must have been used primarily to earn active income. So when you get to 24 months, okay, before that sale, now you might not know when the sale is, but when you get to that point, 50% of the fair market value of the assets of the company. So I don't care what the assets are. They could be tools, equipment, they could be vehicles, they could be real estate, it could be whatever it is. must be used primarily to earn active income. Therefore, you can't have assets like a rental property that are earning you passive income, because your assets have to be earning you active income. Now, this is only 50%, so that's not bad. But at the time of the disposition, greater than 90% or 90% or greater of the assets have to be used for active income. So 24 months, it's like only 50% of the assets have to be used for active income. But when I get to that point where I sell, I need to make sure now that those assets are used primarily, and the term primarily is defined in the Income Tax Act as 90% or greater to earn active income. So these are important factors if you're ever going to dispose of these shares and claim the lifetime capital gains exemption. Now let's move on a little further and talk about the use of trusts and holding companies, okay? So when we get into the use of structuring of trusts and holding companies, there's a lot more benefit. I want to take you back just for a moment to the sale of shares versus assets. So if you sell the assets of your company, of course, we know the company sells them. It claims a capital gain. We'll pay tax on the capital gain and so forth. If you sell the shares as the shareholder and they are qualified small business shares, you can claim that lifetime capital gains exemption. So you might sell the assets of your company, and you might pay, let's say you sell for $1 million. You might pay a couple $100,000 in tax by selling the assets of your company, but you go to sell the shares of your company for $1 million and you're paying almost nothing in tax. So everything looks great, but how do we take that planning to the next level now? And that's where trusts and holding companies come into your plan. So let's start off with trusts. Now, the first thing you have to understand about a trust is not an entity like a corporation. Now, we do separate seminars and webinars on trusts and structuring, of course, so we're going to do more of a surface here today, but you can go back to some of our other webinars, and we'll be putting on some new ones more on structuring in the future. But when it comes to trusts, I'm going to give you a simple rundown of how to use them and what they are. They are essentially a legal arrangement between three parties: the settlor, who sets up the trust with an asset of some sort or puts an initial property into the trust. We have the trustee that manages that property, and we have the beneficiary who receives that property later, okay? So you can think of many trusts, just like a will is a type of trust, because someone passes away, and what happens? They settle the trust with their assets. It all goes into the will. That's a trust. The executor, who's the trustee of that trust, manages that trust, which is the will and the estate, right? And then the beneficiaries are the ones who receive all the benefit, all the assets, the family heirlooms, the cash, the investments, the real estate, and so forth, the beneficiary. So those are your three parties. Name the settlor, settle the assets in, the trustee to manage the assets, and the beneficiary. So again, I'm not getting into too much here with you about trust, but I wanted to give you a quick understanding that's a legal concept, a legal arrangement between those three parties. Trusts typically flow through income to beneficiaries. That's one of the main purposes of a trust, is that it's to flow through the income to the beneficiaries, okay? It's not the only purpose, of course, but it is a major purpose to flow through income. And when it is flowed through, that income retains the same characteristics. What I mean by that, let's say business income comes into the trust and you flow through the beneficiaries. That means the beneficiary receives business income. If it's capital gains that comes into the trust, that means you receive and flow through capital gains and receive to the beneficiaries capital gains income. If it's dividend income, again, dividends go into the trust, dividends flow to the beneficiary. So it retains its same characteristic as it's flowed through from the trust to the beneficiaries. The trusts are used as a flow through for income that comes into the trust to the beneficiaries. Now, each beneficiary, this is where it gets interesting, has a lifetime capital gains exemption. Now, there's lots of other benefits of the trust and lots of other things, but we're focused on exiting the business here. Eventually, one day, whether you sell it, whether you pass it on to someone, whether your next of kin, your generations, whether you want to just leave it and walk away from it, obviously, maybe. But at the end of the day, if you can get maximum value, like Rob's saying, we want to make sure that we also maximize the net amount of cash in our pockets, right? We don't want to sell it, make all this money, and then give a ton away to the government. Let's be honest. That's not our plan. We want to keep as much in our pockets as possible. So because each beneficiary has a lifetime capital gains exemption, and we can take that capital gain and flow it through to the beneficiaries with the same characteristics, That beneficiary can now take that capital gain as long as it's a qualified small business share that was owned by the trust for those 24 months and it passes those characteristics we talked about. That beneficiary can now use that $913,000. Now that's being indexed. I should be clear on that. And that's $913,624 2022. It'll be closer to $1 million probably by next year, depending on inflation. Inflation seems through the roof right now. It'll index. It started at 750 a few years ago. So it keeps indexing and going up. So let's call it close to $1 million. So now you have a beneficiary that receives again $1 million. Well, would we give the second beneficiary $1 million? What if we got a husband and wife? We give each beneficiary $1 million each because we sold the business for $2 million. Oh, guess what? Husband and wife not paying any tax if it's done right, qualified small business shares. You just sold your business for $2 million and paid no tax. Well, let's say now we have 2 kids. There's 4 of us involved. Now we sell the business for $4 million. Guess what? No tax on $4 million. So you see how this starts multiplying that lifetime capital gains exemption by multiplying it using the different beneficiaries by flowing through those capital gains to the trust. We're now talking about millions of dollars tax-free. And again, if you had to sell your business for $4 million, good luck getting away than paying anything less than probably $1.5 million in tax. Imagine giving $1.5 million to the government. Well, it might be a little less. Let's call it $1 million. But could you imagine still giving $1 million to the government? Who wants to give that kind of money to the government? So we need to structure ourselves accordingly so we're prepared for the future inevitable exit, because we will exit our business at some point, regardless. So trusts, therefore, allow you to multiply that capital gains exemption, and trusts, of course, have a lot more value. We're not here to talk about that, but there's a lot more value when it comes to estate planning, liability protection, and tax planning. There's a lot of value to using a trust. Now let's get into holding companies, because holding companies also have a great value in this situation as well. Holding companies are very simple. What are they? They are a corporation or a company that holds assets, right? It's holding the asset. That is the simplistic term of what a holding company is. It's there to hold an asset. Well, what types of asset might it hold? There's different types of holdcos that would hold different types of assets. So there's holdcos that would, just hold shares in your operating companies. And that's it. Just used to hold those shares, maybe receive some dividends. There's some holdcos that are used to invest in passive investments, things like stocks and bonds, maybe cryptocurrencies, maybe, currency trading, things like that. There's holding companies that are used to hold real estate. There's real estate holding companies where you use it to hold the real estate, maybe rent it out to another entity. There's holding companies that are set up to hold specific type of passive businesses. And what I mean by that is maybe a passive type investment, but you're still involved to a point. So various different types of holdcos that are used to own different assets. We even use holding companies to hold assets of tools, equipment, vehicles, and things like that, and rent it or lease it out to a holdco. Now, this borderline holdco because it's more of a leasing company, but again, it's holding those assets, okay? Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to separate those assets out of your company? Well, 2 reasons, probably a lot more reasons, but 2 main reasons. And the first and foremost is that your business, your operating company, attracts liability. So you start buying all these tools and equipment and computers and furniture and vehicles and trailers and whatever else, and you put them in your operating company to use, and you think, great. But someone sues your operating company, and let's say they win, they get a judgment. You now have assets that they can take. But if the corporation doesn't own any assets, then what are they going to take? Many people, if they have no assets in the corporation and they're early on, they simply dissolve a corporation, and within a week, they have a new corporation started up with a similar name and they're rolling again. Believe it or not, I've seen it too many times. Now, it's no good when you're using that to avoid your responsibilities, but this is what happens in society, and you need to understand that. And that's why in your company, in your operating company, you don't want to own a ton of assets. Now, you can own some basic assets. Some computers, some small equipment and tools, fine, small stuff. But bigger ticket items, bigger equipment, bigger vehicles, things like that have value, especially real estate, you would never want to own that in your operating company. Second reason you would not want to own those is because we said that to qualify for the capital gains exemption, that by the time you dispose of it, that 90% plus of the assets have to be used for earning active income. So you got to be very cautious and be able to prove that those assets are used for earning active income. So we don't want to own large scale assets in our operating companies. We use holding companies to hold the assets, right? The other thing holding companies do on top of holding the assets, they allow us, when structured correctly, to remove excess cash flow from our operating company. And that's what we want. We want to remove that excess cash flow from the operating company. Two reasons again. One, liability. Two is you want your cash, which is an asset, to be used for earning active income if you dispose of those shares again. It's the exact same reasons. You want to get the cash out of there, just like you want to get the assets out of there. Now, should you hold some cash in your business? Of course. You got to have operating cash, 3 to 6 months, whatever is comfortable for you based on your cash flow projections. But at the end of the day, you don't want to hold 2-3 years worth of your revenue in there and you're sitting there piling it up in your operating company. Again, just as bad as holding assets in there. Holding companies allow you to hold passive assets outside of the operating company and invest from there. So your holding company may want to invest. It may do investing. It may do different types of investments. Now, if you have some investments in your holding company that attract liability and some don't, you wouldn't want to hold them in the same holding company. You would simply want to set up another holding company. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're dividending a bunch of money from your operating company. You have lots extra, it's dividending up to the holdco. And it's sitting in the holding company and you're saying, I want to invest it. Great. And you go, okay, I want a certain amount. I'm going to put in cryptocurrency and I'm going to buy this piece of real estate over here. You do not want to put those two in the same corporation, because the real estate that you're going to rent out, let's say it's a rental, it's a vacation rental or whatever, that's going to attract potential liability. Now, I know you have insurance, but it's going to attract potential liability. And if something goes wrong over there, they're going to take your cryptocurrency over here. So we want to separate the passive assets that are truly passive in nature, that attract no liability, from the passive assets that are not as passive and do attract liability. We would want to separate those in different holding companies. Now, when holding companies are used with trusts, holding companies should be owned by the trust as well as the beneficiary. This is very important in your structuring. If you have a holding company and a trust, that your trust is the owner of the holding company, as well as the beneficiary listed on the trust. One of them is your holding company. It's extremely important for tax planning. I'm not getting into tax planning here. This is not the meeting for it. There's a whole separate webinar. But at the end of the day, trust me, it's very important to structure it this way when you're using both a trust and a holding company, or multiple companies. So let's now move on a little further and talk about passing on to the company. So now we're saying it's inevitable. You're going to exit someday. You might sell. That's the goal. But let's say you have a way that you want to pass things on to the next generation. You want to pass it on to someone in your family and so forth. That's what we're going to talk about, passing companies on. Specifically, we like to look at the next generation because that's usually where it's passed on to. Passed on to your kids, your grandkids, sometimes nieces and nephews, depending on the situation, typically. Now, it sometimes is siblings and things, but usually the siblings are older with you, okay? Now, one of the ways you can do this is shares can simply be given for work rendered, and there's ways to minimize the cost of those shares, but we also got to look at the sale in the future, so we want to make sure that the value of those shares is important to be fair market value when you're dealing at what's called non-arm's length. Non-arm's length means the person is close to you in family relation. They're not at arm's length from you in family relations. So people like your spouse, your children, your dad, your mom, the people that are connected with you by family are considered non-arm's length. And if you are transferring any asset to someone in your family who's not arm's length, it has to be done at fair market value. What's fair market value? Fair market value is the fair value in the market today that it could be sold for. So if you're giving shares, what can those shares be sold for in the market today? Now, if you're selling those shares or giving them to someone who's non-arm's length, a friend, let's say it's a longtime friend, but they're not related to you, then it's irrelevant. The value can be whatever you and them decide, just like if you sold them a car. Whatever you both decide on that value of the car, or the truck, well, that's up to you. But if they're non-arm's length, if they're family, and you're doing this, or any kind of tax consequence, it must be done at fair market value. So when you're doing shares for work rendered, they should be at fair market value if they're in your family. Restructures is another way that you can pass companies on to the next generation. This might include freezes, butterfly transactions. There's various different transactions. Freezes are one of the main ones where they freeze the value of the shares at that value, swap it out for usually some preferred, and then you take away the preferred over time by redeeming them. And therefore, those new shares are in someone else's name. Now, that's done to get them into a trust, done to get them into a holdco, or done to get them into another person potentially. So depending on the situation, you may want to use freezes and restructures to get those ownership of the shares into a family member's name, or a family member's entity, or a family member's trust, and so forth, okay? Now, one thing I do want to mention before I get to this next topic, of course, if we have a trust and we're passing it on to the next generation, and that's what we did, the restructure, we got a trust involved, we don't necessarily have to move the company out of the trust. We might just pass on the trusteeship or the control of the trust to the next generation. But that, again, is some extensive planning that you want to look at, because it incorporates your estate planning in with this planning of the business exit strategy. And estate planning is so important that you look at that earlier on in life. You don't wait till you're down the road, because there's so many things that will come up that will tie in with your tax planning, your liability protection, and your estate planning. And this all ties into exiting your business, which will inevitably happen one day. Now, one more thing you need to know is Bill C-208 was passed last year. And this allows children to have a corporation acquire the shares of the parents' corporation, and the parents can claim the lifetime capital gains exemption. Isn't that wonderful? Before last year, it was a nightmare trying to do that. You'd have to do a plethora of different things with the lawyer to try to make it work. And it was a bit of a gray area. Now they just passed a bill and said, no, if you pass your business on to your kids, we're going to let you get the lifetime capital gains exemption. Simply wonderful. So that's very important in your planning when you're passing on the company to the next generation. And as I said, the trusts allow you to do it in a simplistic method by transferring the trustee, but there's more complications to that. It must be discussed, must be looked at in advance. So let's talk about a few structuring keys now. We're getting down to the wire of our presentation here. I want to leave 10 minutes for Q&A. So here's some keys to your structuring. First of all, you need to include your spouse if you're married. Period. If you are married, your spouse, you should be planning together strategically on your structure. Even if one spouse is not as interested in it, they should at least understand it. There should be someone who knows your structure. You don't know how many times I've seen where one spouse passes away and they were the ones that knew the structure, dealt with the finances, managed the finances, and the other one's left is the widow, and they don't have a clue what's going on, and we're holding their hands for years. And never mind the stress and pressure that they're going on while they're mourning, but then they realize that it's not a one-time event. So they're mourning, trying to figure out all these finances, but then a year, 2 years later, they're still dealing with the finances because things aren't as easy as they thought, and they're making transition and changing and all these things that have to happen. So the more the spouses can be involved in the structure, the less stress, of course, if someone passes away. But more important too as well, not more important, but equally important is you're planning together. You're minimizing tax together. You're going to minimize way more tax together than one of you alone. You're going to have more opportunities to protect yourself because maybe one spouse will own shares but not be the director, whereas the liability is in the company. So one spouse is taking liability, but the other one has a major ownership in it with no liability. So very, very important to include your spouse if you're married in your structure. You also want to include family members in your structure. So we're talking about your children here typically. Now, if there's other people that are close, you got nieces and nephews, you got brothers that you're super close, sister, whatever, then that's fine too. Include family members in your structure, but we have to look at it strategically. It's very important because there's many options and there's many drawbacks of certain family members being in there. So we have to be cautious of how we do it, but we want to include all family members in the initial option of structuring. We also need to seek professional advice because there are so many pitfalls when you're structuring, and there's so many options that you may not know that are available to you in your structuring. So we got to make sure we look at all those options in your structuring. Okay. And when we're structuring, I've said it before, we want to structure together in one for your estate, your liability and tax planning, right? Estate planning is so important. So when we look at estate planning, we look at how are we passing on the assets to the next generation? How are we minimizing liability so that the debts and the tax or anything are paid and the next generation is not dealing with that inside the estate? And how do we also deal with liability protection, of protecting those assets from creditors so that they can be passed on to the next generation, or we can sell them at the maximum value that Rob's talking about here today? And how do we plan for inevitable taxes to minimize and get those as close to zero as possible? You can't do that, any of that, without planning in advance. They say it, and it's been said over and over again, and it's a great saying: if you fail to plan, you're actually planning to fail. Very important. And one last thing on structuring keys is review that structure annually. So every year you're just taking a quick look at it. Is there any change, anything I need to look at? Taking a quick peek at it. You know, you're always looking at, just like your budget, you're looking at it on an annual basis. You're looking at your structure on an annual basis. So that's about it for today. And my name is Mike Lepitre. I'm from KD Professional, CEO here, an accounting firm. And we've been in business over 20 years. We also provide a plethora of education on our kdeducational.ca website as well. We're going to wrap up this presentation and jump into Q&A here for you guys. Please post all your questions in the chat that you might have, and we will answer them. I know this presentation had a lot of material, so it has been recorded and will also be sent to you. One other thing you'll probably want to know is that we are also offering a free consultation, which you'll talk about at the very end. So if you happen to leave during the Q&A, please know that we have a certain amount of spots available for a 30-minute free consultation. We'll announce it again at the end here. But let's jump into the Q&A portion. So what do we have here? Rob, you have to be ready because we'll have to see if there is anything for you.
We're ready, Mike.
Okay, awesome. I love it. Was that the CEPA presentation format? So that's for you.
Yeah, there actually was based on related material to the CEPA program. Yes.
Good. Good question. Thanks, Brad. Brian, good to see you. Fantastic. Thanks for coming. If my clients are buying a business, do they want to buy shares or assets? That is a great question. And I'm going to comment first. And Rob, I think you should comment second, because I think we both might have something to say here. I've seen a lot of purchases, as well as, of course, I've seen a lot of sales. And what I notice in the purchase is that a lot of times due diligence is not done well enough. It's fine to buy the shares. There's nothing wrong with buying the shares. But remember, you're buying the corporation, everything that goes with it. That includes the history of the corporation. That includes any current tax debts and in current situations that it might be in. Now, tax debts can usually be cut off. There are ways to cut that off. But are there liabilities? Are there lawsuits? Are there, issues with the company that might stop you from buying it? That is really your key when it comes down to purchasing shares versus purchasing assets. You don't want to purchase assets of a corporation that you haven't done due diligence, or maybe that has potential issues. The second point I'll make on that is, if you're buying shares, obviously the seller is going to probably save tax because of the lifetime capital gains exemption, and that should now factor into your negotiation. Just like it would factor into your sale, you might take a little less if you're getting share sale because the tax savings, you weigh that in. Same with purchasing. You might offer a little less if you're buying the shares as well. So depending if you're buying or selling, you want to use it to your advantage. So those are my two comments on buying and selling, buying shares versus buying assets.
Yeah, and I'd have to echo exactly what Mike says. It really boils down to what you know about the corporation and what you find out during due diligence, because you may not be able to buy the shares, or they may not be able to sell the assets. So you've got to figure out what the options are that are the best, first of all, for you, but also take into account what the potential liabilities are associated with buying shares. That's right. Exactly. So great question, Brian. Thank you. A couple more comments. Let's see. They seem like comments. Let's see if there's questions. Thank you so much. Darina for coming. Dana for your comments. Thank you for rewatching. Brian, thank you. So yeah, mostly comments. I don't think I see any more questions in here. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so for any further questions. We covered a lot of ground, so I have a feeling a lot of people will probably listen to the presentation after for a second time, and then maybe they might have some questions after that or want to speak to one of us. That's fantastic. Nothing wrong with that. Thank you, Lloyd, for your comments. We appreciate it. Got them. Okay, so it looks like we will wrap up then. I don't see any more. Thanks, Brian.
So just about that free consultation with either one of us, we will be available. The first 10 people to send the email to Grace. Grace is our moderator. Thank you, Grace, for moderating today as well. Grace from our office, she's been fantastic. We appreciate you. So email grace@kdprofessional.ca, and you can get a 30-minute with either one of us, myself or Rob. Not a problem. The first 10 people in will get it. A couple more comments. Let's see here if we got any more questions. Okay, we do have one more question. Perfect. I'm glad I checked. Henry, fees on trust. Is it expensive to have a manager? So depending on the trust situation, it can be, depending on what the trust is management. Most trustees, if they're managing a trust on your behalf, will charge a percentage for management, is how it typically works. A percentage of the assets is typically how it's done. There are trustees who will do different services, but a lot of times you will be the trustee and the beneficiary yourself, as well as all your family members being the beneficiaries and your corporations being beneficiaries, and you'll manage it yourself. Then you can charge whatever fee you want, of course, that's up to you then. But at the end of the day, yes, you can hire that out and pay a fee, which is typically based on that. To manage the trust itself, let's say if you are doing the trusteeship and you're managing the flow of the trust, really then it's only the trust return every year and maybe some minutes for the trust, and you're less than $1,000 a year for the cost of management. So the bigger cost would be if you want someone to actually manage your assets in the trust and be the trustee essentially for you. Okay, so good question, Henry. Thank you. All right, and thank you, Catherine, for your comments. So that's about it for today. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We appreciate you being here. Thank you, Rob, for your time today. It was tremendous. Thank you, Grace, for everything you've done here today and putting this together. We appreciate it. Look for the recorded version, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys in the next webinar.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mike. Grace.
Thanks, Rob. Excellent. See everybody.
Thank you.